On today's World Insight, the U.S. climate diplomat John Kerry in China. What are the chances of climate action cooperation? And a possible icebreaker in Chile relations, what exactly does the U.S. business community expect from the Kerry visit? The chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in China with answers.
It's necessary that both the U.S. and China come to the table and find ways to help each other.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. The program is coming to you live from Beijing. We start today's program with the latest on U.S. climate representative John Kerry. In fact, he's the special envoy of the U.S. president. His visit to China. Kerry has arrived in Shanghai to meet with his Chinese counterpart Xie Zhenhua. The visit comes ahead of a high-profile climate change summit initiated by Washington later in April. The White House said China is also invited to the summit. U.S. President Joe Biden is expected to outline the U.S. goal of carbon emission reductions by the year 2030, targets under the Paris Climate Agreement. Meanwhile, China has pledged to have carbon emissions peak by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. So, how big is the potential for China-U.S. cooperation on climate action? For John Kerry's visits to China on climate in Beijing, Zhou Ji, CEO and President of Energy Foundation China. Also in Beijing, Jiang Jianyu, Chief Representative of Environmental Defense Fund, Beijing. And also in D.C., Jennifer Turner, Director of the China Environment Forum from the Woodrow Wilson Center. Such a lovely occasion to see all of you once again. It's been a while that we haven't talked about the climate change. And now I'm so glad it's back onto the priorities. Ms. Turner, good to see you. We haven't talked to each other for 2 years. What do you make of the latest visit by Mr. Kerry, Secretary Kerry?
Well, I think it's quite exciting. It's clearly a reboot of the climate relationship that has been on, I guess, shall we say, on snooze for the past 4 years, since the past administration was not interested in working on climate. So, I mean, I think it's quite encouraging, even though we're maybe you're not going to see huge progress overnight, because again, we're restarting the relationship after 4 years.
I hear the birds chirping in the background where you're standing. So I'm so glad that you are back onto the program. Let me go to you, Jianyu. Haven't seen you for quite some time. What do you make of the potential of this visit?
Yeah, but I've been following you with WeChat all the time. So glad to see you again.
Good to see you.
Same here. Very excited. Icebreaker, and also I want to say that. Hopefully that the negotiation will not only lead to climate breakthroughs, but also is the beginning of a new era of U.S.-China relationship with regard to the bilateral.
Well, here's the thing, isn't it? That people say this could be the common ground. I mean, if this could not be, what will, right? Climate change is the challenge facing everyone. But on the other hand, there are real difficult issues between the two countries. When the environment has been soured and toxic, can the two, the special envoys from both sides be able to really work on the climate change issues? Mr. Zhou.
Yeah, I think the two groups, I mean, Secretary John Kerry and Mr. Xie, they have known for many years already, and I take it for granted. I mean, the two teams, as old friends or old colleagues, they talk about climate change over 10 years. But now the situation, the political environment seems to be totally different from 10 years ago, even 7 years ago. But but I think it's still possible for the two sides to reach some agreement if they just take their common ground for the human interests. I mean, global safe climate.
I see. Well, I think your answer has more hope than the real necessary content that we are likely to see, but I'm sure we're going to talk about that. Jianyu, tell me more about what are likely to be the areas to be touched on by the two sides. After all, they've already have several rounds of discussions between Mr. Xie and Mr. Kerry. So this time is much more public because Mr. Kerry is making a trip to China. So what are likely to be some of the concrete issues on the table?
Well, I think both sides having been making moves, actions, statements with regard to their own ambition on climate change. China, since President Xi made the groundbreaking announcement on September the 22nd for China to achieve early peaking by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060, President Biden has been making climate change as a center issue of his campaign. And he immediately returned to the Paris Agreement on January the 5th. And right after he came back to the White House, and also has been making that as also a centerpiece of his rebuilding plan for the United States. But both sides also facing challenges on a range of the issues. But I think it's really time, and I think they really have common grounds that they can touch upon. But because the bottom line is, I think both sides recognize climate change is an existential threat.
Right.
That really, if we want to find a solution for that, we need to work together.
Ms. Turner, the U.S. committed to 2030, China committed to 2030, the U.S. committed to 2050, China committed to 2060. As the largest developed economies and emerging economies, certainly the two sides have real commitments. The next step is the roadmap and how they would correlate with one another, both in making a statement to the international community together and also in doing their own housework well. What do you see are some of the concrete issues on the table?
Well, I mean, in some ways, previous two speakers covered some of this, but I think that they are both going to be talking about, what their near-term, both countries are going to need to take faster action now to really be at the 2050 or 2060 goals. And I think that there could be the issue of, maybe also thinking about helping developing countries to lower their CO2 emissions. And I think with President Xi's, desire to green the Belt and Road Initiative, and President Obama talking about how foreign policy is climate policy, that you could really see some potential that, I don't know if it's direct collaboration, but coordination of helping to lower CO2 emissions in countries that are struggling right now to do that.
Cooperation in the third country or internationally together, that could be certainly a step forward. Let's take a look at details as to how much the two countries, China and the United States, are spending on clean energy.
Biden's $2.3 trillion infrastructure plan, if signed into law, would be one of America's largest federal efforts ever to stem its greenhouse gas emissions. The plan would see the U.S. invest $35 billion into clean technologies and spend $174 billion on overhauling the country's electric vehicles market. But that still pales in comparison to what China has spent on clean energy research and development in recent years. China's R&D spending climbed 10.3% to $378 billion in 2020, outpacing the U.S., according to China's National Bureau of Statistics.
Now, there are several issues that probably has to be defined well before the two envoy can really make strides forward. One is the issue about technology and security, Jianyu. National security has been used as a buzzword, especially by the United States, I think. So, well, there are different arguments from the other side, though, that it's too much of it exaggerations of it, using it as a buzzword rather than know the real interpretation of it, has harmed the relationship, and so will be in the environmental protection area. After all, many of the technologies could be dual. Tell me more about how is this likely to have an impact on the overall process?
Well, I think people have been making buzz with regard to transfer of the technologies, but I think we need to remember that technology transfer itself was built into as one of the core pillars for global climate cooperation.
Indeed.
Into all the climate agreements, including the most recent one, the Paris Agreement.
Yeah.
So the developed nations has an obligation to transfer the technologies to help the developing countries to take care of their existing situation so that they can move forward. If you look at what China has been doing with regard to the Belt and Road, the Green the Belt and Road Initiative, China has been one of the largest builders of the renewable technologies into the other developing countries. So I agree with the previous speaker that I think the two sides, instead of looking just at each other under the microscope, they should really try to touch on new ground to work together. And one of those areas is to work together in the third country and help to bring them. And technology transfer could be one part of it.
Jennifer, keep on nodding her head. I saw it already. Jennifer, you want to come in on that?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think too that also when we think about technology, I want you to think beyond solar panels and wind turbines.
Right.
One area that was for many years, particularly in the Obama administration, fruitful, cooperation on energy efficient buildings. It still continues today between the U.S. and China about low cost, no cost options to make buildings more energy efficient. I mean, they're the big footprint of our energy and carbon in both countries. That kind of area should also be considered. I mean, managing demand, reducing demand, and as these developing countries are building their buildings, they wanted, like following China's path now, China is also working on making more energy efficient buildings. And so that's another kind of sector to look at. Just wanted to interject that because I think don't just think about wind turbines and solar panels.
I've been having really some time that I haven't heard much positive interactions between the Chinese and American side. I mean, both are friendly, very intellectual exchanges, but not necessarily, that one would build on the points of the other and have a real interaction of improvement of points. This is the very first time, shall I say, in quite some time over the past year that I have hosted a discussion like this, which means, I guess, once the real issue discussion starts, we could always find common ground. Well, who am I to say that? I guess, Xi, you are better in knowledge to say what is the nature of this likely discussion between the two envoys and likely the momentum they lead the two groups and the two countries to. Mr. Zhou.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I want to point out that, my other two...
Okay, I think now the two envoys, they met together to discuss real common interest issues, climate change, and also to front the way for the two sides to cooperate for multilateral issues and the bilateral issues, including ambition, pathway, specific technology, finance, very broad issue there. But one thing they need to be very careful, to avoid some negative impact on their talk by some negative forces. They are not necessarily useful for the on-the-ground cooperation.
This is a great point. I was thinking just how the two gentlemen have to work, how hard they have to work, because this is not an issue that is purely about climate change. this is really climate change, but really about politics. And they have to report to their home turf, to their own constituencies, to the public opinions, to the politicians at home. This is a gigantic, I would say, a project that these two gentlemen shoulder. Jennifer.
Well, yes and no. I mean, keep in mind that U.S.-China energy, climate, and clean energy cooperation is kind of built into the DNA of our relationship. I mean, not just under the Obama administration, but there has been a lot of collaboration, and not just at the gov to gov level, but NGOs, foundations. We have the Energy Foundation here on the panel, universities. They have continued to cooperate and do work, and so I think, and that's been also a very important foundation when it comes to the bilateral relationship. Because again, talking about the at the political level, but the boots on the ground, that has been happening with scientists, NGOs, researchers, foundations. So I think that I mean, again, I am a more glass half full kind of person, but I've been sitting and have a front row seat for 21 years here at the Wilson Center, and I've seen this as it has really been, think of it as science or climate or environmental diplomacy, that when the relationship is going up and down, which it always does and it always will between our two countries, but climate and energy relationships, conversations have just continued. So I think it actually is more of a stabilizing effect.
Mr. Zhang.
Potential.
Well, I couldn't agree with that more. Really, myself is really blessed by U.S.-China environmental collaboration dated back to 20 years ago, when then Premier Zhongji traveled to the United States and signed the first U.S.-China bilateral dedicated environmental collaboration. But Tianwei, for your point, I also want to say that Eisenhower used to say, if you really want to solve a problem, make it bigger. So maybe right now is the opportunity, for the two countries to recognize the common ground through solving the climate crisis, which is an existential threat. Then we open the new doors and avenues for other areas of collaboration.
Yeah, another issue is about the timetable. China has already committed to 2060 when going carbon neutrality. That is a huge commitment, because one has to recognize it's only 30 years after carbon zero that China goes there. Of course, for the other developed economies, it's 2050. Well, it's understandable, as the industrial age of the developed economies have been going through for decades, if not longer. So, but there is debate about that, about the timetable. How important it is, Mr. Zhou, that we are not blocked, by empty debates like this, but rather focusing on the real issues every step of the way, the roadmap, the implementation, the mutual checks on each other, and also mutual support on each other, Mr. Zhou.
Yeah, sure. In fact, that's a matter of how to design the time frame. Over 30 to 40 years. So from the perspective of history, the time given to China is much shorter than the one to developed countries in the history. Normally, developed countries spend over 40, even 50 years to reach neutrality after peaking. And while China only have around 30 years. And that's a matter of innovative development pathway. So that means we need to find some way ahead, totally different from the one developed countries experienced. And then we need to design the milestone over time, and also to see what technology, the technological roadmap should apply to, and then how to invest in those technologies, how to finance them, and what policies and the institutional arrangement should be made. So this is a, long-term design, but starting from now.
Mr. Zhang, I understand that China has already begun this process, trying to come up with the specific roadmaps and specific marks to be met and implemented. What is the latest process so far?
Well, my understanding is that after the groundbreaking announcement on September the 22nd, not only President Xi has been making statements worldwide, by our account 7 occasions, but there have been 3 important really milestones in the domestic policy making. One is December the 18th last year, the Central Committee's economic planning meeting. Then in March, in the 14th five-year plan, that the early peaking plan was highlighted, and then it was re-emphasized again in the party's economic meeting on March the 15th. So I think a really significant effort has gone into the making of this early making plan, not only at the national level, but start to get distilled into the provincial and also at the sectorial levels.
Right.
I think we have every confidence that a master plan, a detailed implementation plan will be rolled out soon to guide China from now on to 2030 to achieve this early peaking.
We have 1.5 minutes left for Jennifer. Tell me more about your assessment of China's latest development. And what about the U.S.? Do you have a specific plan? Do you have specific marks that the others could also check whether the U.S. has been doing its job?
Well, I think that, we have transparency here on what and measuring on what our CO2 emissions have been. And I think that next week when the Biden-Harris administration announce what our goals are going to be, for the roadmap, I think that is going to be announced next week. But I want to interject something a little different here, that just because you've been talking about the formal talks, but let's talk about when Xi Jinping, when he made the announcement last year that China is going to move away from internal combustion engines and really promote electric vehicles. And you've seen them on Chinese streets. That was a global game changer, right? All around the world now, the automobile industries are pivoting. You're seeing countries investing in it. And so I just wanted to kind of interject that while we have these formal climate talks, there's actions that in this case China and the U.S. as well, that when our two countries, when each of them make decisions like this, it has kind of, shall we say, positive ripple effects, and and maybe starting off kind of like a race to the top on clean electric vehicles. So I just wanted to add that in here.
Of course, there is very important balance to be kept. One is about the green development. The other is we don't want to greenwash either. But how to keep that balance, that's a very important question. Another thing is geopolitics and also different approaches to green development. Well, the U.S. is having on April the 22nd and 23rd a global climate change conference. China, Germany, and France are also going to have their own conferences before that later this week. We're going to see all the latest and exciting developments, certainly from different perspectives. Thank you so much, the three of you. It's finally to see you again. Zhang Jianyu, Jennifer Turner, Zhou Ji, good to see you. Have a great evening and have a great day. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight. Still to come on the program. A possible icebreaker in Chile relations? What exactly does the U.S. business community expect from John Kerry's visit? The chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in China with answers next. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. John Kerry's visit is the first official trip to China by a ranking Biden administration official less than a month after the Anchorage meeting. The visit follows the release of the U.S. annual intelligence report on Tuesday that said, quote, China's effort to expand its growing influence represents one of the largest threats to the United States, end of quote. And of course, China disputes that. So despite the dire warning, could climate action be an icebreaker for frosty relations between China and the United States? What does the business community expect from Kerry's trip on that? I visited the office of American Chamber of Commerce in China and talked to the chairman, Greg Gilligan. Here's our conversation. Mr. Gilligan, good to see you.
Thank you. Likewise.
Busy springtime. Secretary Kerry, who is now the special envoy for climate change representing the president, is in China this week. Now, from the business perspective, how much expectation do you have for this trip?
We're very glad that Secretary Kerry is here in his new role as special envoy, because to address common concerns for environmental protection is something that is less controversial than many other issues in the U.S.-China relationship. So we kind of look at it almost as an icebreaker event that will allow the two sides perhaps to find some commonality and ways to move forward together. Naturally, it's important for the entire globe because the U.S. and China are the two largest emitters of carbon dioxide in the world. So for the world to address environmental protection, it's necessary that both the U.S. and China come to the table and find ways to help each other.
Though there are a lot of details, devils are in the details. So, Mr. Gilligan, some say probably now these days narratives is even more important than the content. What do you say?
I think that as long as governments allow enterprise to engage, that we can help to provide solutions.
Like what?
Well, carbon neutrality, you mentioned a moment ago. And enterprise are already actively planning on how to improve carbon neutrality measures in their own business. We would maybe then go take it a step further and suggest how governments can appropriately regulate those efforts.
At this point, we know it takes both sides to tango, but at the same time, it takes both sides to have the courage and wisdom to take the first steps of their own. Now, do you see that is happening, or Washington will have to wait until Beijing takes all the first steps before Washington do anything because of the so-called toxic political environment back at home?
I think both sides are taking steps. We recently saw senior officials with a meeting just a few weeks ago, and
which
now
is quite a drama.
Yeah, there were some theatrics, but you know, both countries have domestic politics and they play to them. And then behind closed doors, you know, perhaps there were some other things that allowed the meeting that's occurring these few days to happen. So this is a step forward, just weeks after, you know, the drama that we saw on the news cycles of that time. So I think there's plenty of reason to remain optimistic and to seek these commonalities.
How much do you think views, thoughts, ideas, suggestions from the business communities are being heard by the two governments? Let's just say AmCham's ideas and suggestions toward the U.S. government.
Well, we have a very active outreach program. Previously, we used to call it the door knock. We used to go once a year or maybe twice to Washington, D.C. We would visit Capitol Hill, the White House, the administration, think tanks, the academic policy community, etc. Now, because of the COVID reality, we've moved it all online, which is to say that we can bring more people to the conversation, and the conversation can be longer and it's easier to schedule. As such, we're getting, I would say, you know, warm welcomes from U.S. government in setting up these discussions. And we're going to take those, and we're also going to share our talking points and some of the issues and things that we identify with the China government. So I think that the U.S. government is receptive, but it is true that the atmosphere has changed. I don't mean to paint too rosy a picture. Things are challenging in the U.S.-China relationship, as bad as they've been in decades. So it's even more important now, like it was 50 years ago, with ping-pong diplomacy, for us to remain engaged, stay in these conversations, and try to find a way forward.
I understand recently there are at least 2 meetings being arranged. One is by the NDRC, which is an important government entity of China, on the planning and also implementation of the planning, between them and also the representative from the U.S. business community, as well as a encountering online between the Chinese premier and the European and American business communities. Mr. Gilligan, how do you think these kind of interactions could help?
We provide very similar recommendations, or the expression of the hope of American business in China, and that is, help us find the way to remain compliant and do business that meets national security and law enforcement expectations, but then keeps as broad as possible the commercial lane. We don't want broad definitions of those previous things to narrow what could appropriately be commercial opportunity. What we also say to both sides is that there should be equality of opportunity. If one country can go and invest and take advantage of market opportunities in their counterpart country, those opportunities should exist for the other side as well. And so there should be more equanimity in that relationship. And so we certainly champion and applaud, but look for additional reform and opening here in China. And this applies to both sides as well, we also look for clarity of regulation and consistency in its implementation. It's tough for business to operate in an opaque environment. We need to know how to comply, and we need to know where we can expand on commercial opportunity.
Are you hearing positive response from both sides?
To be frank, I would say that the U.S., the new administration has shown much open-mindedness, but they're also very new in this term that just began on January 20. So it's going to take time for us and them to get deeper into conversation. I would like to give credit to China government for lots of opportunity to engage at a high level. You mentioned a few of the meetings with the NDRC and the Premier and others. And I have been in and anticipate being in future very high-level discussions as well to continue to reflect the needs of American business here. We believe that we are the ballast in the relationship, and we want to continue to be that stabilizing force that helps the two countries to be able to sort of take a step back and work on the other issues.
Talking about timing, you specifically mentioned this is the very beginning of this new administration. It's very understandable. And if we think about things in the other shoes, that would be the best way to communicate, isn't it? But on the other hand, there is an urgency about China-U.S. relations, about the right strategy being applied, not many steps that are toward going to the opposite direction of having a constructive relationship. Even though, Mr. Gilligan, from this part of the world, some look at it as negative. For example, using human rights treatment, punishment toward individuals, and now it's becoming reciprocal. And also, for example, of punishing and listing the so-called supercomputer institutes of China's and put them on the blacklist. None of these are very constructive from this part of the world as believed. So, and we haven't seen much positive ones. Should people have much confidence about what Washington is doing, especially this new administration? Or are we going to see much more hostile reality than the earlier rosy, shall we say, expectations many will at least love to have compared to the earlier administration? This is a loaded question, but I just want to set the stage for you, sir.
First of all, I think people and our two societies should have confidence in each other that we have managed a challenging relationship over many years now.
Indeed.
50 years ago, with the implementation of ping-pong diplomacy, we found a way to break the ice. Now, the ice has become thick again at this point in time, but there's no reason that we can't have confidence to once again find the way forward. So the use of entity lists or blacklists by both sides, the criticism by both sides of each other's human rights records, all those things accrue to politics, which we as a Chamber of Commerce studiously avoid. We are acutely aware of the geopolitical implications of what happens, mostly so that we can stay out of them, because we're not equipped to deal with those issues. We are equipped to follow clear, guidelines by government on how we should conduct our business in an ethical way that contributes to society. So in that, though, I would say that recently there have been some positive examples where some companies, and I can't name them, I don't want to call anybody out in particular, but some companies that have been identified and put on these lists have also gone through a process that then released them to allow greater commercial opportunity. So it's not all that everybody that goes on that list is just lost into, you know, sort of the black hole of having been named. Some of them are actually subject to additional scrutiny that they then pass and move forward with their businesses.
The latest news about the cotton thing, that has been such a big debate, but that put us to a second thought about the global supply chain. We thought it was earlier only about high technology, but this time it could apply to everything.
Quite frankly, I think that we are having challenges recognizing and accommodating very different ideologies in the way that the U.S. and China approach society and governance. I would like to remind everyone, though, that these ideologies were not different at the beginning of U.S.-China diplomatic relations.
Even more, probably.
Indeed. And at that time, there was a recognition of the differences, but an idea that we would find a way forward recognizing those differences. So now there's more, it seems to be more of an expectation that the other side yield to the ideology of the other, and frankly, that's not going to happen. We should get beyond that. We should get back to the way we started this very productive, beneficial relationship.
If you listen to the new administration's latest remarks, there has been a combination of words, such as partnership, such as competition, such as rivalry, all are being mentioned. And therefore, it's blurred as to which apply to which, at what circumstances, and what time. Shouldn't the two sides have this emergency of defining what exactly is the nature of this relationship?
I think about this in the context of what I call the 4 C's.
Please go ahead.
ABC, you know, C. And so one is conflict, which we all need to avoid at all costs. The other is confrontation, which frankly is going to happen and perhaps should happen as we disagree with the very different actions of the other side. Then there is competition, which I think is a great thing, and we should embrace competition.
As long as they're fair in both
Absolutely.
sides.
Indeed. It needs to be equitable in terms of the rules of the competition. And then there is cooperation. So what's necessary is for us not to, I would say, avoid all these things with the exception of conflict, but to recognize that they're out there and then define each one. What are the things that are likely to be in those categories? So where are those areas where we're likely to confront each other? Because frankly, those have been a part of the diplomatic relations for so many decades. Mm-hmm. Some of them disappeared in the previous 4-year administration, and now they've reappeared, and so everyone's like, oh, wait, why are we talking about these issues? Well, we've been talking about them for so many decades now. Let's just get used to it, that that's a part of international diplomacy. Then competition should be embraced because both sides have very vibrant economies, continental economies that will support innovation, research and development, and growth for the people of both countries. And then cooperation in areas like we talked about public health and protection of the environment, in things like the governance of global monetary policy to the benefit of the global economy. There's so many areas where we can cooperate. Now, I think there's also an exceptional opportunity, as China's done exceptionally well economically, managing through the COVID-19 crisis, but also in going forward with a sort of a new 5-year plan and other things about the economy. The U.S. economic situation is also quite bright. There is
For this year. we know.
significant growth
rate,
happening,
yeah.
greater growth predicted, and will likely be the case for the next few years, especially if one thinks about whatever size of the infrastructure package that comes into play. The same way that China drove tremendous growth for decades with infrastructure investment, that's going to happen with reinvestment in infrastructure in the United States. So when we embrace competition, we can do so from a position of confidence that each of us has exceptional domestic opportunities, but then also more opportunity together. There needs to be an abandonment of the zero-sum mentality that I only win when you lose. It needs to be, let's make the pie bigger and find ways to share it.
Let's make the pie bigger and find ways to share it. That is, according to the chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in China, Greg Gilligan. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.